The goal is not to be famous or, be the next Kim Kardashian. God love her, it works for her. But I think for me and most people I know, is like, get real specific on where you can add value in the world, what kind of relationships you want to build. And that's the kind of content you want to put out there.
Stand by. I'll be right there.
Hello and welcome to Minter Dialogue, episode number 336. Today is Sunday the 14th of July 2019, and this interview is with Tom Schwab. Tom's a speaker, author of 2 books, coach, and a successful online entrepreneur. Tom's passionate about helping brands grow from obscure to acclaimed. And having founded Interview Valet, Tom's an expert in helping getting guests on the podcast they need in order to get heard. In this conversation, we discuss Tom's experience in the United States Naval Academy, the successful trajectory of his startup Goodbye Crutches, and a deep dive into Interview Valet and how to make a great podcast. Welcome to the Minter Dialogue podcast, where we discuss branding and all things digital. I am Minter Dial, your host, and you'll find the show notes on my eponymous site, minterdial.com. Enjoy the show. Tom Schwab, what a pleasure to have you on the show. You actually came across me at some level before I came across you. You were kind enough to do a review of my first book, The Lost Ring Home. And obviously there was a personal connection there, and we've stayed in touch ever since. And you've created a great business, which is in the heart of podcasting land. So we're going to do a podcast about podcasting. But first of all, tell us, Tom, in your own words, who you are.
I am a blessed man. I just look at it. I was born in the Midwest, suburb of Chicago. I had never been more than 100 miles from my hometown. And then I had the rare opportunity to go to the United States Naval Academy. Yes, I have a ring, just like your grandfather had a ring. And for me, it exposed me to the world. At the age of 17, I'd never been on a plane. By the time I came home a year later, I'd been around the world. I'd spent a week in Australia. I had learned so many different ways of looking at the world and people that it changed my worldview forever. So with that, I got out of the service, went from one stable job to another stable job. My dad told me I was a fool when I left the Navy. It's like, how can you leave that stability? And I said, Dad, I just need to do that. And went for a Fortune 500 company, went to that stable job, and then had the opportunity to go to straight commission. And at that time, my dad called me a dang fool. He says, you can't do that.
You graduated to dang foolness.
Or words to that effect. But I always was striving, always that entrepreneurial, what was out there. I love learning. And so from that standpoint, I was able to have experience in engineering and operations and distribution and sales and marketing. And we talked about clarity. The only clarity I've ever gotten is I look back at each step brought me to where I am today. And today I'm in Kalamazoo, Michigan. It's a small town halfway between Detroit and Chicago. But it just proves that you can connect with the world any place. Today, if you're isolated or ignorant, and you have access to the internet, it's by choice. So I run a company called Interview Valet, and we introduce inspiring thought leaders, authors, coaches, speakers, brands to their ideal customers by getting in on podcast interviews, by getting in on that conversation. Because honestly, today, as people talk about breaking through the noise, I have to laugh. I think most of the time we're just adding to the noise. I'm trying to use the same strategy that my grandfather used. Getting introduced and being where your ideal customers are. The only difference is that it's the new technology we're using it for. So I always look at it as we are the new version of the old thing.
Love it, Tom. So what on earth made you apply to, and then, of course, bravo for getting into the Naval Academy from Kalamazoo?
Well, actually, what caused me to apply was ignorance. I did not know how competitive it was. And all I knew that I was 16 years old, looking to go away to college, and I had applied to a couple local universities. And at that time, Northwestern University was $8,000 a year, and that was tuition, room, and board. And I remember doing the math thinking I would never make $32,000 in my life in order to pay this back. And at that time, there was a young man, a midshipman, that came back, and he had done what I was about to do in the next couple of years. He'd been around the world, been to sea, just ran into him, and he told me about how not only did the education get paid for, but he got a stipend of $60 a month. And I thought, this sounds like a great deal. So out of my ignorance of not knowing how competitive it was, I applied. And by the grace of God, I got in. And I always say the grace of God because I am not qualified, physically qualified to be in the military. I have no depth perception. Now, some people could say that I'm shallow. I just see the world in 2D. So when I look through binoculars, I see two images. And that was all over my paperwork for my pre-commissioning physical. But they didn't figure that out till my senior year at the Naval Academy. They didn't read that part of the report. And by that time, they'd invested enough money in me and they gave me a waiver. But to me, it was just that youthful exuberance of not knowing how hard things were. I say the same thing right now that my granddaughter's 5 years old, and she doesn't know that there's things that she can't do. So she tries them. And I think at 17 or 16, I was the same way.
That's beautiful. So what year did you graduate?
I was class 87.
1987. Exactly my year as well, Tom. So we are of the same age, exactly. Your experience in 1987 must have been radically different from 1932, or at least how would you describe those differences? Because what I heard was in 1932, it was rare that people actually graduated.
I would say I think that my experience with the class of 32 is probably more similar than my experience, say, with the class of 2019. From the standpoint of what I hear about the Navy today is that it's technical. You know, when your grandfather went off to sea, he communicated with his family back and forth with letters. Mm-hmm. That's the same thing I did. Now they're out there. They've got Facebook Messenger. They can talk real time with that. And so from that standpoint, things in the Navy in the 80s were probably more like World War II than they are today. So from my standpoint now, when I talk to midshipmen and they talk about the things they do, the Naval Academy having air conditioning, I'm like, wow, how do you air condition that old building? And why would you do that? So from that standpoint, I feel like a dinosaur at times when I talk with the younger people. And I remember being on a podcast interview and somebody asked me, did it worry me that there were young 20-year-olds that were now running a nuclear power plant? And I thought about it, and here I am at the age of 53, and I said, that doesn't bother me. What bothers me is there's young guys my age that are now admirals from my class that are making the decisions. And to me, they just seem way, way too young to be doing that.
So, Tom, last question on the Navy side. You wear your ring. To you, what does a ring symbolize? Because I've learned so much about rings in my experience, but I'd love for you to talk about the ring for you.
The ring is, it's like a fraternity, right? You can spot somebody that's wearing a Naval Academy ring. I only take it off. The last time I took it off was for an open water swim because I knew I did not want to lose it in a lake. But every time that I put it on, when we put it on before we graduate, it's always our class crest that comes closest to us. So that's the closest to our heart. When after you graduate, you flip it around, and it's the Naval Academy that's closest to your heart. And I remember looking at old timers rings when I was at the academy, because you'd always see that, and they were just so worn. On the bottom side, there's chain links, and they're very, very prominent when you first get your ring. And then after decades, the gold is soft. You start wearing it off, and now it's just smooth. And so I look at that, and it reminds me of how long I've been a part of this, and that no matter where you are, you can find somebody in that. It starts the stories. It starts the conversations. In fact, I was just at a meeting about 3 weeks ago, and I was speaking at it, and somebody came up afterwards, and their first question was, "Is that an academy ring?" And I hadn't talked about it in my bio or anything. And sure enough, his grandfather went to the Naval Academy. And so it was just that bond there. So even with my kids, we've joked that my daughter has laid claim, being the oldest heir, that all she wants is my Naval Academy ring, and I'm like, of all the things, that's what you want? And she said, yes, because I know that's what means the most to you, and that you've had it on your finger ever since I've known you. And she's right. She was born 18 months after I graduated, and she's always known me with that on my hand.
That's a lovely story. So, Tom, you launched Goodbye Crutches, and I'm really keen to understand. Explain to us what it is, and the journey that took you on, because it obviously is part of the road you've gone on, albeit with crutches.
It's interesting because as I tell the story in hindsight, it makes perfect sense. As we were going through it, it was on a prayer and a whim. So I had been in the medical device industry, selling artificial implants, knees, hips, shoulders, to surgeons and to hospitals. And when 2008 started, and Michigan led our nation, into the Great Recession, the manufacturers wanted to buy back the distributorships. They wanted to cut out the middleman, and which makes a whole lot of sense until you look in the mirror and you realize, hey, I'm the middleman. And they did the right thing by me. But as my bride and I looked at it, we had a sideline business, and it was direct-to-patient durable medical equipment. So if you ever remember seeing those little knee scooters that people put their knee on instead of crutches, at 2008, those weren't widely available. And we were renting them locally here in Michigan. And the thing that struck me is that it was a profitable business model, but even more so that about half of the units that came back would come with thank you notes. And I can think of a decade in medical devices, I have less than 5 thank you notes, and I've kept each one of those.
and they're probably just to do with you and your relationship and who you are.
Right, but this is we looked at it and said, I know we're doing good with this. We're helping the world, but can we do well with it? Is this scalable? And I knew at that time I didn't want to build a brick and mortar old school business. It was not the time in the world to do that. So I had read a book by 2 smart guys out of MIT, Brian Halligan and Dharmesh Shah, that founded HubSpot.
Sure.
And it was called Inbound Marketing, How to Use Content to Attract, Engage, and Delight. And I looked at that and thought, this should work for e-commerce. And once again, just like when I was 17 years old, I didn't know what I didn't know and thought, let's give it a try. And we were one of HubSpot's first e-commerce case studies. Beretta USA, the oldest company in the world, was right up there with us. So it really taught me the new world of how you could use the internet to help people, to serve, that those people that provide the answers get the trust and the respect, and building a relationship, not just a transaction. So we took that company from a regional player to a national leader, sold that company off in about 3 years, and it really taught me about how to use the internet, the new world that we live in. And it was great because now I look back and everything along the journey, the Naval Academy, the discipline, the learning, the nuclear power, on how to systematize something, how to build a culture and a process around that. The corporate world that taught me sales and marketing, even distributorship. All of those things have come together to where we are now.
You mentioned at the very outset this notion of what your grandfather taught you, sort of, the old-fashioned values, and mixing that into what you were talking about with Goodbye Crutches on answering the questions that people want to know about and building relationships. How would you advise people who want to craft that kind of trust, even answer the right questions and then build those relationships? What are the things that we should be doing, maybe reverting back to your grandfather, but also just in general, to craft that kind of long-termness and trustworthiness that established you?
I would have to go back to the worst business advice I ever got. And that came from my grandfather. And it's the only wrong thing that old Irishman ever told me. Here I am, 17 years old, having a beer with him before I go to the Naval Academy.
Tisk, tisk.
He probably thought it was my first beer. But I can still remember what Jimmy Cunningham told me. He said, choose carefully who you drink with because you can't choose who you work with. Now, for him, that was true. He was a mechanic in a small town. If you didn't live within 10 miles of him, you weren't his customer. And so he had a limited amount of customers. That was his world. But Minter, that's not our world today. We've got an unlimited amount of customers. And so with that, I look at it and say, be careful who you drink with, but even be more careful of who you work with, right? Because if I don't want somebody to have that conversation, that relationship of having a pint with them, I sure don't want them around my family. I don't want them around my business. I don't want them around my employees, my other customers. So I think it starts with that of who do you want to work with? Who do you want to have those conversations with? Who do you want to service? Who do you want a long-term relationship with? And this idea that it's everybody, if you're having a conversation with everyone, you're having a conversation with no one. And so that the goal is not to be famous or, be the next Kim Kardashian. God love her, it works for her. But I think for me and most people I know is like get real specific on where you can add value in the world, what kind of relationships you want to build. And that's the kind of content you want to put out there. After a while, everybody knew that if you had a question about your car, go talk to Jimmy Cunningham. Well, I think it's the same thing where if people have a question about your niche, if you're that person that they go to, if you're that, I've heard somebody the other day refer to it as key person of influence in that niche, that's what's important. So to me, it's really figuring out what you have to offer the world and who you'll put on this earth to serve, because it's not all the billions of people. It's your small tribe.
Well, I'm a big believer in that. Daniel Priestley, perhaps, is the name associated with key person of influence. He began out of Australia, and I worked with him on it, the KPI, as we call it. Cool. So, Tom, let's get into Interview Valet, because obviously I'm hugely interested in podcasting. As I told you before we got online, the Global Editors Network, podcasting is really landed as a thing in media, where we've got nearly 40% of Americans listening to podcasts. They're on the Himalaya in China. There are purportedly 70 million podcasts being originated out there, and so we're in a space that is obviously in a good space and growing. So take us through Interview Valet. When did you get into it? How did it come about?
Really, it came about as an evolution. So as I was in my sabbatical phase between Goodbye Crutches and whatever I was going to do next, I was helping some people that I was in a mastermind with. And they said, could you help me with my digital marketing? Sure, I'd love to. And one of the things that I saw is for some people, writing a blog was a homework assignment. And I'll count myself as one of those people. I'm an engineer by heart. I joke that English is my second language. I'm not sure what my first one is, but I've written a lot of blogs in my life, but it was always like a homework assignment. For us to talk here is fun. It's easy. And I noticed this with some of the people that I was helping. And so I hypothesized, could you use podcast interviews much the same way we used to use guest blogs? So instead of writing a blog, putting it up on your own website and getting it seen by a limited number of people, could you guest, blog? Could you get on Huffington Post, Wall Street Journal, wherever that audience is, get that know, like, and trust, get that audience, and get the authority that comes back from that. So I started to test that with podcast interviews. And originally I was blown away by the conversion rates. A good blog will convert 1 to 2% visitor to lead. And we were seeing 25 and 50%. And at first I thought, no, it's got to be a niche. It's got to be a personality. And so I went back to my nuclear power days and tested everything, refined it. And what I realized, no, it's a system, right? If somebody listens to you for 30 or 45 minutes and they resonate with you, it's almost like a personal introduction. Just like my grandfather would do at the country club. Well, we're at this digital country club where Minter's introducing me to his friends. And so we started to test that. We started to refine it. And I didn't want to build another service agency. So I thought, I'm going to write a book. I wrote the book, put it out there. It sold well. And then people said, you need a course for this. So I put together a course. And I never took it out of beta because it sold well, but I could see from the back end that people weren't getting through it. They weren't getting results with it. Mm. And so as I would ask them, most of the people would lie to me and say, oh, it's great. I'm just waiting to implement it. And I'm like, just ask me for your money back. I see you've only gotten through chapter 2 of 6. Just ask for your money back. I'll give it to you. But the ones that were honest said, you've given me a cookbook, you've given me the videos on how to do it, but I don't want to do this. I want to be the guest. I want you to take care of the rest. And so in 2015, based on people asking for it, we started to beta test this done-for-you full-service agency. And it worked so well that in early 2016, we took it out of beta, called it Interview Valet. And now we've grown to a company of 16,
nice.
all geographically diverse employees. But not everybody wants to live in Kalamazoo, Michigan with me. So we're all in the United States, but geographically diverse. We serve about 90 different clients at a time and throughout the world. So to me, it's amazing. Like I said, I tell my mom, we introduce people that should know each other. So our entire mission is to personally introduce inspiring thought leaders to millions of ideal customers that they could serve for the betterment of all.
So you and I know that podcasting is doing well. And how would you describe why it's doing so well?
I think it's the medium and the flexibility of it. And first of all, I think to even call it podcasting, I think in 5 years we may look back on that and laugh. Even today, I've asked my daughters, what does the pod stand for in podcasting? And they have no idea because they don't know a world with an iPod. And other people I ask, do you listen to a podcast? And they'll say no, but then they'll start talking about some radio show that they listen to. And I'm like, well, technically that is a podcast, right. There's other people that'll put the video up and they'll watch that. Well, is that a podcast? Mm-hmm. I don't know. I think what it is that this medium gives us the ability to produce the way we want and for people to consume the way they want. Not only consume it, but at the time they want, so it's evergreen, at the speed they want. Studies show that 70% of the consumers in the United States listen at podcasts sped up. I typically listen at 2x as I run at half x. And it's just because my mind wanders. And if I don't speed it up, I don't concentrate on it. And so from that standpoint, I think it's this great medium that we can tell stories. We can easily communicate and then repurpose it. So, somebody asked me, if podcasts now at 40% of the U.S. population listens to those, when do you think it'll get to 100%? And I had to think about that, and it's like, I don't think it ever will. Newspapers and televisions never got to 100%. 10% of the U.S. population is hearing impaired. Deaf people aren't going to listen to a podcast, but they can take that transcript, which is so easy to do now, and they can consume it that way. People can take the videos or put some B-roll footage over it, and they can listen to it that way. I think we're getting to the point now where very soon we're going to be able to index the videos and the podcasts for not the entire segment or the entire episode, but even segments in it. So people will be able to find the segments they want. Google just came out in early 2019 and acknowledged that they're transcribing and they're crawling all of the podcasts. So I don't think it's going to be long before they can tell you what podcast episode it is or what YouTube video it is and tell you where in that you should start listening. So I think what we're doing makes sense. It's the new version of the old thing, communicating, telling stories, getting people to know, like, and trust us. And where it's going to be in the future, I think it's going to be the same way. It may look different. We may call it different, but it's still communicating the same way.
I was just thinking about this notion of how it's similar to the old days and why video isn't even more similar at some level. But it does harken back to the old days of the vinyl record, the radio shows where they would tell stories, the shadow knows, only the shadow knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men. And the imagination that goes without having the video that sort of tells you, like an ice pick in the forehead, what it is. And somehow I get this feeling that you can't hide from being real in the audio thing. You can't really hide in video. But somehow this intimacy being in the ear, not in the eyes, it's sort of in your mind in a different way. And somehow it just creates a different relationship as opposed to seeing in a video format.
Harvard University had their first ever conference on podcasting last year. It was called Sound Education. And they made the point that this is the golden age of podcasting. And they had a wonderful keynote where they talked about the similarities between radio and podcasting in the early days. Mm-hmm. And I think you're right. There's that authenticity that comes through with audio, and sometimes not even over-engineered audio. I sometimes think the best podcasts are the ones where you're sitting down in a diner and there's two people in the booth behind you that are just talking. Sometimes that is, at 2 a.m. after the pubs close. There are other times it's 8 a.m. over breakfast. And you want to listen in, and it would be rude for you to join in the conversation. It'd be rude for you to turn around and watch them. But there's just something about listening in. And as you talked about the stories over audio, I think of like Orson Welles' War of the Worlds. If you listen to that on the radio or the recordings of that, it is amazing. And I remember watching a remake of it on video, and it was hilarious. I think if I read the book, I would know, it's just a story. But when you listen to it, there's something just real about it and intimate, because as you listen to it, one thing that we can't do is multitask by listening. So when we do listen to something, we focus on it.
It's like the idea of reading a book and then seeing the film. And why so often that's a deception is because your imagination has created these characters, a beauty that's in your eyes, the one, and the imagination of things. And when you make it so real in the video, it's disappointing because it's not up to the par of your imagination.
And I think it also goes from how people learn. Some people learn from books. Other people learn from hearing. So at the Naval Academy, I would be much better off going to class, listening and taking notes, or the night before a test, we called them gouge sessions, where everybody would come together and they would talk about, what's going to be on the test. How do you do this? I would do better with those than I would just going back to my room and reading the text, because that's how I learned. And I think different people learn in different ways. And I think you can see this even in the roles they do. I had a conversation with Christopher Lockhead, who's a 4-time CMO. He's got he was the co-author of Play Bigger there. And he's got a learning difference. He's dyslexic, and he swears that many people in the C-suite also have that. And, you won't give them a 150-page document to read. You come in and they want to talk to you about it. They want to ask you questions. Mm-hmm. So I think that's how they learn. Even now, I say that I read 2 to 3 books a week. Honestly, I listen to 2 or 3 books a week, and I listen typically at 2x. I bought the physical copy of your book, but that was after I had listened to the Audible copy of it. And so from that standpoint, that's how I, quote unquote, read. I read with my ears.
And there's nothing like the other element in narrated audible by the author. I mean, presuming the voice is good and the reading is well done. I'm just listening right now to the end of Becoming, by Michelle Obama. And she's a marvelous narrator. So I was just going to make a call out to my friend Siobhan McHugh, who, for those of you who are interested in the state of podcasting, she does a thing called the Radio Doc Review out of Australia. And it really looks at what is great podcasting, and it is a force to be held. So, Tom, when you are doing your work, you've now obviously come across a lot of podcasts. Typically, you're presumably looking for inserting people into interview-style podcasts. Correct me if I'm wrong. And what I would be interested to hear from you is what makes for a good podcast that's findable and has long-term success.
I think we can go back to calling this the golden age of podcasting, looking at what makes a great TV program or what makes a great radio program. Sometimes I'll go back and listen to or watch the early television, and I scratch my head and go, people actually spent time watching this? There was an evolution, and the ones that stick around that are still classics are the ones that tell stories, the ones that tell timeless things. And I think that's what we need to focus on. And I think early on in podcasting, you saw parallels to easy interviews done by the host and the guest. So it's very easy if you give me 5 or 6 questions that you ask every guest. It's easy for you as a host. It's easy for me as a guest. But it's not interesting. Mm-hmm. And it gets stale very quickly.
Totally. Mm-hmm.
And so from that standpoint, I think it's those conversations, the stories, the follow-ups that go beyond the talking points. Mm-hmm. If I watch MSNBC or any of the shows out there, I know that the leader is going to come there with the same PR-approved talking points. It's going to be the host has an agenda, the guest has an agenda, and we're going to work it out here in 5 minutes. And, oh, by the way, it could be edited. So you never know. To me,
talk about inauthentic at some level, right? It's all prepared.
Exactly. It's like another advertisement, right? It's just a different way of doing it. And I don't think you learn about either person. And even the information that you learn is probably already out there. So to me, it's that backstory of how can you have a conversation? And the best hosts are the ones that are curious, that go down different areas, and bring up timeless points and timeless lessons, and even help the guest learn by follow-up questions. I've been on over 1,200 podcast interviews, and there's probably 150 of them that I would consider therapy sessions for myself, where they ask a question where I have never thought about that before, or why did you do that? And to me, those are interesting conversations. And one of the things we look at with our clients is the message, right? Are you interested in being interesting? Because if all you want to do is an infomercial and sell a product, podcasts are not the place to do that, nor do we want to work with you on that. So I think people that have a self-awareness, an openness, a transparency to go beyond just the talking points and are interested in having an interesting conversation. The podcasts I see taking off now are the authentic conversations. And some of them are conversations that you may not resonate with. That's fine. They weren't made for you. Other ones are. And to me, those are the timeless ones. And I think that this is an evergreen media. So we want to make sure that the content we put out is timeless. Now, there are some podcasts that could be talking about, local sports or local politics, and those are very timely, right? So I really don't care about it after the election. We had one client that worked with us, that he was a Fox News contributor, and he was on their cybersecurity. And the point that he made it is that you've got to be careful on evergreen content, because everybody wants you to make a prediction. Well, if you make the prediction before the election, afterwards there's going to be two types of people. One of them is going to say, everyone knew that. And the other ones that say, I can't believe that idiot missed that one. Or so he said it's a no-win. And so he said it's a different medium. So if it's a live, on-demand medium, yeah, you talk about the daily things that are going on. But podcasts that are evergreen, if you want your content to be evergreen, you need to talk about that higher level things. You can use modern day examples, but don't be in the middle of a podcast and wish somebody, a Merry Christmas. For God's sake, we're recording this in the summer. Don't wish them a happy 4th of July and Independence Day, right? Because not only are you saying that this is the time of season we're talking about this, so if you hear it in the winter, or if you're in Australia and it's already the winter, it's just going to sound dated and timely. Or if you're talking to someone in London and you mention Independence Day, it's like, no, that's called Trader Day. So from that standpoint, try to keep it as generic. I don't want to say generic, as timeless. To different audiences. You don't want to be so generic that you try to appeal to everyone, but be conscious of the audiences you're talking to and the times you're talking to.
That's great stuff, Tom. So it makes me think, as I was listening to you, on the one hand, I have this narrative, which is, in order to be interesting, you have to be prepared to be personal. Because in the end of the day, giving me this business success, and I ran this and I did this great product, and I'm successful, my earnings went up 18% and so on. People want to know about that because they want to replicate success. But at the same time, if you want to be interesting, somehow you've got to be in your dark side. You've got to be in the mistakes you've made, the feelings you've had, or the fact that you can bring in your daughter and your grandfather into this conversation.
It's interesting because I hadn't thought of it that way, but I was listening to a podcast the other day. They were talking about AI, and I guess most of the press releases now for earnings reports are all done through artificial intelligence. They know if it beat expectations, you're supposed to say it skyrocketed. So an AI, a computer, can do the press release for my business, but for an actual discussion and insight, a computer is not going to be able to tell the stories and draw corollaries on different things. We had a discussion here about the Naval Academy and what the rings meant to me. I've never had that on any other podcast interview. Since we were first brought together through your grandfather, I felt more comfortable talking about my grandfather. So there's different things there. And Brene Brown talks about, courage and vulnerability.
Sure.
And that Netflix document show that she did, I was just watching that with my mother-in-law. And she mentioned about how some people thought courage and vulnerability were on opposite sides. And it's like, no, they go together. And so if you want to have a great podcast interview, you've got to have the courage to have a great podcast interview and be vulnerable, be real. And for some people, that can be scary. And for some industries, that can be tough. You look at Elon Musk got in a whole lot of trouble being on a podcast interview and being being himself. I mean, that's not something that you would expect from the normal CEO, but from Elon Musk, I'm like, didn't surprise me. So from that standpoint, that was a podcast interview. That was not a business CNBC interview.
Right.
So there's differences on those.
Well, totally. And, so many of these CEOs who are, let's say, I call them more mercenary CEOs who, let's say, didn't found the company and aren't the company in their DNA. They may think they are, but they, got a great career within it, and they finally promoted to CEO as opposed to Musk starting it where he is, like a Branson or any of these other massive founders. And they spell it, and they live it, and they dream it, they sweat it, and they are it. But so many business leaders who are not those founders fail at the hurdle where it moves into my personal, because maybe that you sort of exemplify vulnerability, imperfection, and that's going to worry people. First of all, I have a chip on my shoulder. I don't want to talk about that. Second of all, it's going to worry my shareholders. And then you end up with these bloody, robotic type of interviews in podcasts, but also personalities and interesting-less brands.
And repetitive too, because it's the same interview that you've heard on all the different media outlets. And so what's interesting about it, I could read the press report and know that. I know the talking points. I know what they're going to be mentioning on there. And you're right. I think it's a different person. I heard the concept from Eddie Yoon, who for Harvard Business Review wrote a book called Super Consumers. And he called Missionaries and Mercenaries. Mm-hmm. So like you said, the mercenaries they're there, they're getting paid, they've got a job to do, but do they have that zeal? Do they know the story from the very beginning? And as you said that, it's like having an interview with somebody that's got that mercenary zeal is a whole lot different than a tactician that's there doing a job, a mercenary.
So as you were speaking, the second thing that came into my mind was Brian Solis's new book, Life Scale. And let's say the first 8 or so books that he wrote were all very much focused on transformation, how to survive, using tech, new digital. He was the number 2 person on that recent list of the top influencers. And there's been a huge landswell of interest in the book because he's just opened his kimono to his life and expressed weakness, true vulnerability a la Brene Brown. So you got that on the one hand, but that's sort of hard to necessarily convert into my life and the way I'm going to improve. But on the other hand, going to the China market, where we were talking about that before, where there's this huge knowledge e-commerce, and you also mentioned the students that might use audio podcasts to complement their studying. It does need to be practical. So as much as we might whine on or wind on a story that's truly personal and spills my guts, on the other hand, there does need to be, or there is a market, an appetite for, God, how do I make money? How do I convert from 2 to 3%? How do I, get better Facebook ads? And where there's a sort of extreme practicality to it. In China, the one that the intensity of the competition to get into university and so on has made the audio podcast the true differentiator. So people will pay for that to get really solid business advice. How do I become a better leader? How do I do this? And it's really all about how-tos. So there is a market for that. And yet I so agree that, stories beget stories, and only through authenticity and intimacy in the ear will you garner a really interesting popular audience in your podcast.
And I think in the U.S. what we see is people will use the strategic discussions from a monetization standpoint to move people to their website to buy the tactical implementation, because the tactical is changing all the time. And no matter how great of a communicator I am, I know that people are listening to me. They're multitasking. The chances that they're going to listen and execute on everything, I know that that's not. You mentioned Daniel Priestley. I listened to his book. I couldn't remember his name, but I remember his voice. And the first thing I did after listening to his book is I went to the website. I signed up for the information, got more information about him, got the physical book to go to that next level. So I think that's where people are doing it. And the tactics are changing so quickly that I think it can be even dangerous to talk about those on a podcast. So a lot of times podcasts may take 2 to 3 weeks or 2 to 3 months from recording to going live. So I think of so many podcasts I've listened to or books that I've listened to, and they'll refer to a platform that doesn't even exist. And inbound marketing, Brian and Dharmesh's book, they had to come out with a new version of that, I don't know, 5 or 6 years afterwards, because if you read the original one, it's almost funny. Some of the platforms they talk about, the things that were that big at that time, and now they don't even exist, or the readers are listening and going, what is that? So from that standpoint, the tactics are changing so quickly that if you do go off of the tactics, I think you're almost like a sports podcast then. Maybe you'll get people coming back all the time to listen to what the new sports score is or the new tactic, but don't expect people to download past episodes and listen to the recap of last week's game.
Well, it's funny. So a shout out to Daniel, to Halligan, lots of good friends in common. So one last question for you, Tom. You mentioned this idea of sending questions and then having the exact answers you always want. Is it your recommendation for me as an interviewer not to ever send out questions?
I think it's very helpful to send out a theme of where we're going with this. Of, hey, here are the things that I think my audience would be interested in. Here are the things that I'm curious about. Here's where I would like to go. And I think that's very, very important, as opposed to just showing up from the guest side point and not knowing where we're going with this. What's the goals? And I think for me that was very helpful. But to have 10 questions where no matter what I answer, number 5, number 6 is going to come. There are times where if they asked me what book is on your nightstand, and I answered it, that I just killed my wife and her bloody bodies at my feet, they would answer, "That's great," and they'd go on to the next question. Right. And I swear there are interviews like that, and I just look and it's like, this isn't a conversation. It's almost like if you've ever been to the job interview, where the person is just going down, has to ask you all of these questions, but they really don't care. They're just trying to get through it. So to start out and to answer your question is like, yeah, I would love to know where you want to go with this, where we can bring the most value for this. Because that way it gets my mind of where we're going in this, and I don't go off on tangents. But I think there's benefit in that. But if you follow a script and stop listening to the answers and following up on that, that's where it becomes dangerous.
Yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, as I listen, I do want to listen to you. But when you're interviewing, sometimes you need to listen, and you don't want to interrupt because you want to listen. At the same time, you need the next flow, and which part of, especially if it's like a 5-minute, monologue of sorts, you know, which part do you want to pick up on and surf into next, and you can choose, the second minute, the third minute, the fourth minute, the very last thing that's said. Tom, it's been great having you on the show. I really, really enjoyed it. I feel like maybe we should do it again. At the end, in the minimum, I felt like we could have gone on for a lot longer. But time is of the essence, and we want to respect our audience's ears and time and all that. So, as you know, what's the best way to connect with you if there are people that are interested in using your services to get onto shows, how to get into that, and get your book, of course?
Well, thank you, Minter. I was going to say the only thing that could have made this better is if we were both sitting down in the same place. I hope our paths cross in real life soon. I also know that as people are listening to podcasts, they're doing many things. They're multitasking. They're listening at 2x speed as they run at half x speed. So I always try to make it easy. If you just go to interviewvalet.com/Minter, I'll put everything right there. So everything we talk about, I freely give away the book that I wrote. So if you'd like a copy of that, that'll be right there. There's a checklist that we use before all of our podcast interviews. If you're doing any podcast interviews, please download that checklist. In the military, we've said checklists are written in blood. Make sure it's somebody else's blood. So learn from other people's mistakes. And then finally, I'll put all my social media on there. If I could be of any service to you, please reach out to me. I'd love to get to know you. The richness of our lives is the richness of our relationships.
Beautiful thing, Tom. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Minter.
Thanks for having listened to this recording of the Minter Dialogue Show. You'll find the show notes and other blog posts on minterdial.com. If you enjoyed the show, please head over to iTunes to give a rating and review. And to finish, here's a song I wrote with Stephanie Singer, A Convinced Man.
Tell myself there's no use in me lying. I'm a convinced man building an urge. I'm a convinced man to live and die submerged. A convinced man in the arms of a woman. I'm a convinced man, challenge my fate. I'm a convinced man, competition's innate. A convinced man in the arms of a woman. Despise revenges and struggle to see. Live for the challenge so life's not incomplete. What's wrong with challenge? I know soon we all die. I like the feel of a stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger. To feel free, trust in my reason, and let me show you why.